I really don't like buying new computer equipment unless I absolutely have to. Partially because I'm cheap, and partially because of some other made-up reason I'll give to make myself sound better and feel good about saving the earth while I game all day and consume electricity. So when Ryzen first came out, not only had I already been hurt by Bulldozer, but it just wasn't cost effective. Then GPU prices hit in 2020. Either way, I've been craving a budget Ryzen system basically since the day Ryzen came out, and now, finally, we can build one. And only for $550. Or $500 if you're like me and lowball people, but don't be like me. People don't like that. Of course, I want to run through a parts list. But as always, when it comes to used hardware, this can vary quite a lot, and you can obviously change it up depending on your needs or if you get a solid deal. So starting out with the headline of this build, a Ryzen CPU, I went with the Ryzen 7 1800X. Yeah, it's first gen Ryzen, but you can still get a solid 8 cores, 16 threads, and 3.6 gigahertz for less than $100 now, which is just crazy. 8 real cores, not bulldozer cores. I actually got a Ryzen 3700X for $70 for this video, but I think that's a little lucky and kind of unreasonable. Plus, mine came with about 50 bent pens. If you are more focused on gaming though, I would highly suggest trying to snag a 3600X though, instead of an 1800X for a similar price. In terms of the motherboard, since this is pretty budget but not insanely budget, I went with an open box ASRock A320M because it's a decent brand and it's cheap. And yeah, that's it. $57. If you really want to go super cheap, the AM4 motherboard I have in my main PC, in terms of RAM and SSD, I went for 2 sticks of used Corsair Vengeance 8GB 3200 sticks for $30. And for the SSD, I thought I had a regular 500GB M.2 SSD, but I do not. So we're going to pretend this SATA SSD doesn't exist and just add $50 to our parts list. In terms of case, I went with the Thermaltake Versa, I don't know, H17 in black. Mostly because it was $48.14, but also because we got an MATX motherboard and I wanted a more compact build, because why not? The fake brushed aluminum also looked kind of good. For the power supply, honestly, I've pretty much only used EVGA power supplies, and I don't want to suggest products that I don't actually use myself and trust, especially power supplies. So I went with a $67 EVGA 500 watt power supply, and this has actually been in my backup server for 3 years maybe, and it's held up fine. Now for the second most fun part, the GPU. Or graphics card. There are a ton of options nowadays with cheap GPUs. Maybe not as much on the newer side, but the used market is insane right now. With the extra $170 or so on our budget left, we could get a GTX 1070, RX 48GB, Radeon RX 5700 XT, or maybe an RTX 2060 if you can stretch it. Out of those options, I went with absolutely none of them and got an RX 6600. Has 8GB of VRAM and supposedly supports ray tracing, so I was pretty curious to see how that would work and how the performance would be. And I got this one for $170 exactly, since I made an offer and happened to get it. So for around $500 plus or minus some depending on your build, we can get a solid last gen GPU, and well, I mean, it's first gen Ryzen, but if that's a problem for you and you really need better single threaded performance, I would highly suggest getting a 3600X to throw in here instead of the 1800X, since they're very similarly priced and the 3600X has much better single threaded performance. Plus, it takes quite a bit less power, so if you're worried about that, now we can put this bad boy together. If you want to put one of these together for yourself, check out my affiliate links in the description. They, money. First, we just need to take the side panels off the case, of course, and get our little bag of goodies here out. Not that one. Which made me notice this case doesn't actually have any form of sound deadening, just plain metal side panels. Not a big deal, just something I noticed, and frankly, when it's on, you don't really hear anything. It also has 2 dust filters, one on top and one on the bottom, but nothing in the front. And since my motherboard didn't come with the box, I decided just to put it all together in the case, even though it's kind of inconvenient. So I went ahead and set it in and realized not all of the standoffs were put in for some weird reason. And I went ahead and just put some new ones in that came with the case. Then you can go ahead and just set the motherboard on, remembering to put the IO shield in if this actually came with one, and just screw it into the standoffs. And remember, of course, to have your screw bit get stuck on a screw and just get really confused where it went. Normally at this point, we would already have the CPU and RAM installed, but like I said, not doing it this way, so we're gonna go ahead and do that now. First, with the RAM, you just line up the little notches on the RAM to the notches on the motherboard and slide those in, then push until they click. And always remember, real men know these are just like USB ports, and sometimes you just gotta flip them over twice because it reset something, I don't know. And then the CPU. Go ahead and line the triangle up on the corner of the CPU to the triangle of the motherboard and slowly lower it in. This normally should not require any force at all, but mine did need some force because I don't know why. It's done this since I got it. I've had this chip for a decent amount of time and put it in quite a few motherboards. Yours should not need any force so to go into the socket. Once it's in and securely seated, you can go ahead and lower your retention arm, and now your CPU is mostly installed, barring the heatsink. Now at this point, don't put in your GPU like I did, since you'll have to remove it to plug in the power button and front panel LEDs. So I went ahead and put mine in, so I'll have to remove it later. Now we can do power supply. This should simply slide into the basement area of your case, and you can easily screw it in once you have it orientated the right way, which is fan side down, so it can draw in fresh air from the bottom where it's all filtered and stuff. Fancy. Or, if you're like me, you can fight with it for no apparent reason, trying to achieve a common goal, only to understand why divorces happen. Oh hey, I got it. Now, at this point, I normally take my front panel cables and route them around where they need to be, trying to keep them kind of hidden away, and plug them in. So USB 3 would go right over here. USB 2, which yes, this case does have front USB 2 ports, would go here, and the front audio panel connection is here. For these little bastards, you're gonna have to look up the pinout for the motherboard you're using. For this specific board, I found a PDF that told me where these all go, and just plug them in. Only to realize this PDF was wrong, and it's already labeled on the board. So great. Then you just go around the back, pull the slack from all these cables, and zip tie them to kind of slightly make them look somewhat neatly-ish. Just like that sentence. This case honestly isn't too bad when it comes to cable management, for power at least. I just routed my CPU power through this small hole in the top, GPU power through this small hole in the bottom, and my motherboard power through this giant hole on the side. Then plugged them all in, made sure they click into place, and then pulled the slack on the back and zip tied it. I know this really isn't the best cable management job, but I am gonna have to pull this whole thing apart like 2 or 3 times for filming, so just, alright, it's good enough. I would pretty much just call this functional cable management. It works, it looks all right, it doesn't restrict any airflow or anything. And honestly, it would probably look a million times better if you couldn't see the front panel cables all up here. Also, I was supposed to install an M.2 SSD, but I don't have one, so I'll just put the SATA SSD, hide that, yeah, I'll hide that back here and just hook up the power, connect SATA cable to the motherboard, and yep. Also, don't forget your fan header for your case fan, and lastly, we're gonna mount the CPU cooler. I normally do this last so it doesn't block my CPU power cable, but for this specific cooler, all you have to do is take the default AMD top plate off with 4 screws, and then lower these 4 red spacers over the holes, place this metal bracket on top, and then screw through the bracket and spacer into the back plate. Do this on all 4 sides, and then you can dab a little bit of thermal paste into the center of the CPU, and then lower your heatsink on. Then you just have 2 screws on top here to screw into the metal mounting bracket, and then attach your fan and plug it into the CPU fan header. Normally I would add an extra fan to this, but we're pretty much at our budget limit, so I'm gonna just see how this performs with 1 exhaust fan out the back, and in worst case I'll add a couple more. And also, don't forget your GPU, like I almost did while I was putting this together, but that's probably the easiest part of this. For your GPU, all you have to do is just loosen this little top screw here on the back port, take out these little PCIe display adapter blocker things, I don't know. All I know is they come out easily and I lose them every time. Then you can just slot your graphics card into the top PCIe slot and make sure you plug in the power. Now all that's left to do is power this bad boy on and install Windows. And while I was in the process of installing Windows basically forced me to keep my ad settings enabled, or it would do this. So that's great. But now we can get into testing. Since this is a gaming PC, we're going to start out with gaming. Obviously, starting out with CSGO. I was able to run really well, low to mid 200s at 1080p high settings. Not too bad, very reasonable. Doom or Eternal with RTX on, but no DLSS options for some reason. Ran at 120 to 150 FPS with high settings 1080p. And Halo Infinite ran in the low 100s on a small multiplayer map with medium settings and this one weird RTX setting turned on. Very, very playable. Maybe you'd want to lower the settings to run at a consistent 144 FPS or 1440p, but for me, this is perfectly playable and very smooth. Metro Exodus, as usual, ran alright. I got it running at high settings, normal ray tracing, got a stable 80 to 90 FPS without much of any stuttering. And honestly, this actually performed pretty well considering I had ray tracing running on an AMD card. Pretty interesting result for me. BeamNG, medium settings, was 50 to 60 FPS in Italy. Pretty decent, but I would probably lower them a little bit personally, but not too bad, like I said. Minecraft obviously ran fine, 150, 200 FPS with some drops loading new chunks. And I also wanted to try Red Dead Redemption 2, but it would just crash when I tried to launch it. So that was a waste of 25 bucks. And in terms of heat, even with just the one fan, this case was actually able to keep everything pretty cool with the CPU not even coming close to thermal throttling. GPU was a pretty similar story. I mean, I don't have anything that's very high wattage in here, but still good to know. And if you want, this could also be used as a perfectly usable video editing PC. I actually used a Ryzen 1800X in my main editing PC for 2-ish years now without really any problems. And my 5D Classic review exported in just 13 minutes 20 seconds in 4K, which honestly really isn't that bad at all. I will say though, if you plan on using this as more of a workstation, After Effects will absolutely destroy your RAM. If you want to do a lot of animation in After Effects, springing for two 16GB sticks of DDR4 instead of two 8GB sticks would be an amazing idea if you could swing it. Honestly, I would even get a cheaper GPU to do it. And I will say I did want to test a similarly priced Ryzen 3600X to see what the performance would be like, and also build a separate Intel system for $500 and compare the value of all three of these systems. But after speaking with my accountant, she said that it wasn't on the budget for this video, so I tried to speak to her manager, who declined to comment. I'm going to work on that, so subscribe in the meantime. And if you're interested, I would highly suggest checking out my recent video on the AMD FX series. For some reason, they still cost about the same as a Ryzen 1800X, for an 8350, which isn't even 8 real cores. So I was curious to see if it was any good nowadays, and I was pretty oddly surprised and not surprised, so I'd highly suggest checking that out if you are at all interested.